talking about definitions and terms, I always figure some of the best practice is to let them speak for themselves, because I don't want to put words in their mouth. Right. And when I'm looking at this, I want to know what the truth is. I want to know, is this stuff that's objective? Is it reliable? Can I believe in it? So I'm going to go straight to the source and look at what they have to say. Saul Alinsky is one of the heads of modern community organization, and very active in the 60s and 70s. So he was very connected to a lot of transformative movements in our country. The thing about Alinsky is that, for instance, with this book, which is Rules for Radicals, and he's got Reveille for Radicals, this is basically a primer for putting radical change into practice. So I like to say, when we look at the Alinskyan rules and the things he talks about, they show that ideology, but it's one of those things, we have to look at it and say, he's one of the voices that is coming in a long line. What he's doing, it is wrong. I believe that, and I think there's good evidence for it. But he's not the first one to be doing it. Bellamy and the ones who came before him, and we could talk about the mid-1800s too, with changes that happened in the social framework there also. To social Darwinism, for instance, was a good example about some of this.
But this is a name that people will, in our time, will remember.
It is.
Still fresh enough.
A lot of very, very famous political figures have been connected to Saul Alinsky.
Obama. Clinton.
Hillary Clinton was asked by him to join, he asked Hillary Clinton to join him in some of his work, because she actually studied him for her own work in law school, so she knew him personally. People have laughed and said, oh, it's ridiculous to talk about Alinsky, you're demonizing him, you're trying to pin everything on Clinton's and Obama's with him. That's what they say to people who talk about this openly. Well, we need to look at what he said. We need to look at what's happening around us, and we need to say, well, is it consistent with what he said? Is it consistent with what Bellamy and those other people were saying? And if the answer is yes, then it's not a thing where we look at emotionally and say, well, you don't get to say that just because it sounds so horrible.
Yeah, it's fact. It is what it is. And the sooner we recognize that, and the sooner people research that and find out, like you're preparing to do right now. I mean, you're gonna read a few things, I believe, that are going to inform the public on what to watch out for. If you understand what your enemy is thinking and doing, what their processes are, and the psychology, the manipulation on society that they perform. I mean, they're good at it. And if you're unaware of what they're doing, you're going to get took.
Yeah,
they're going to get you.
You need to always be looking at the ideology behind what is being said, and look at it and say, does my ideology have something that is stronger than that?
Yeah.
Because that's really the core question. And, Disney movies are a great example of that too, or any kids show, anything. When you watch those, there should be a filter there in our heads.
That's right.
Whether you believe they're good or bad, that filter is something you need anyway, just to be a healthy, mentally health-minded, yes. So from Saul Alinsky, this is just one of his books, as I said, and this one is from 1971. One of the reasons that I bring this particular one in is that he has in his rules rules of the ethics of ends and means. And you have to understand, for Saul Alinsky, he goes against dogma. He says, I am against dogma, but then he has one. And he says, well, it's okay if I'm dogmatic. It's okay if I have an ideology. And the implication is because I happen to be right.
Yeah, of course.
And the other thing that he consistently talks about is that words are relative and definitions are relative. So that's the framework that he comes from, that he's getting. He's coming to it from a tradition that he has picked up himself. So these are a couple of rules from his 11 rules of the ethics of means and ends. So Rule 10, I'll just read this, is that you do what you can with what you have and clothe it with moral garments. Now we see that all around us today. We've been talking about justice, for instance. How often do you see something happen and someone will say, a social change, a transformation, the tearing down of statues, the complete changes that they're making to parts of the Constitution, things like that. And they say, that's the just thing to do. It's the equitable thing to do, that there's an overriding morality.
So they're going to demonize great men and women because of something that was terrible. In their time, it was an institution. So we're going to tear down their statues.
And it's a misunderstanding, I think, in many ways of why Americans have statues. We don't have statues to worship the people.
That's right.
And in a lot of those cases, when we look at those statues, it is an occasion for us to remember what they did wrong as well as right.
Yeah.
But in a lot of times, we should be looking at it and saying, we need to be wary of what we're being told today, too, with what's being said about everything. So that should always be a reminder. Cancel culture is a big reminder of a reminder. Put it that way.
There you go. Yeah. I understood that.
Good.
Yeah. Well, okay, go on.
So here's more about what he says of rule number 10. And he says that all effective actions require the passport of morality. And when we're talking about the changes we've seen this year, the changes for 2030, the things that are being said, nobody's coming out and saying, let's move toward a global society because it's the wrong thing to do. No one would listen to that. And they don't really, I'm sure many of them believe it is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But this passport of morality for Saul Alinsky, he's saying openly, whatever you believe about it, it's a relative term, use it that way.
Okay.
So number 11 of his rules, these are the two, just really, really, with what we're talking about, they match really well. The 11th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that goals must be phrased in general terms, like liberty, equality, fraternity, of the general welfare, pursuit of happiness, or bread and peace. But it comes back to this idea of words are relative, values are relative, they don't mean anything. The problem with all of that is it may sound great, but when you say relative truth is absolutely true, you've made an absolute statement. Mm-hmm. So is that the correct absolute truth? Well, it's our duty to look into it and find out rather than just accepting that.
That's right.
And it's really easy for people to get caught up in those things because it's true. Most people in America say, I want to live a really pleasant life that helps other people and loves other people and helps them become better. And, that's what makes us such, I will say, such easy prey in a way. Because we need to be checking our terms and saying, well, is the thing you're saying that you're calling it good and just and pure and clean, is it really, what does it really mean? We need to look at what those things come from, what the tradition is that they're associated with. If you read something like Edward Bellamy's book, what you see is a world where everything has the one employer, and it's the nation, and the nation gives you all of the things that you need for all of your needs. And underneath it all, they talk about how much choice they have and how much freedom they have. But then they talk about how they don't have individualism, how excessive individualism was the problem. How all of these things that we thought were good made us like animals. And at the heart of all of it is a sermon near the end of the book, where you actually have a pastor who's speaking to a congregation of 150,000. And the character's so impressed, 150,000. Yeah. Changes from today. And a core of his sermon comes down to human nature is inherently good. So it shows you how it all pins on that worldview. If you're looking at something like the 2030 year and you're saying, I want what they have, well, somebody's going to have to be the moral agent behind determining who gets what outcomes, who gets what wealth redistributed. There is some moral agency.
Yeah. Yeah, that every time that comes up where they want to centralize power over everyone else, like during the mandates, who determines who's guilty or not? COVID. Who's sick, who's not? Do you have COVID or not? Well, we know the PCR test is not, it was never working right. But yeah, somebody has to be that consistent angelic angel that can always be consistently right every time when determining who's going to get this and who's not going to get this. And that's what you're basically saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Founding Fathers looked at that and said, that's why the Constitution has to be something firm and unchanging. You can't have changing moral structures. You can't have one man say this and then one man say the next thing. That will no consistent system there.
And that's why a mob can't be in charge. We can't rule by majority because that can change. Those people can change. Which brings me to a point, in the late 50s, 60s, Christianity was taken out of the schools. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I believe somewhere in there.
62.
And that was because of a justice or a Supreme Court ruling, which they don't rule, they present opinion, and then all of a sudden it becomes law of the land somehow. I don't get that, but that's that whole common law thing where they can make whatever law they want. But do you think that had a huge effect on the agendas that we're experiencing today? Was moral education supposed to be taken out of the public view and our public schools? You think that was intentional?
I think so. I mean, the founding fathers were really clear about it, that this only works for immoral people. And they're not saying because people are inherently good. They're saying because people are inherently not, and you need that moral framework. That's right. But for the churches, it was such a crisis because when you're not educating kids and saying there is this absolute truth, there is something that is unchanging and it's beyond you, then what do the kids have to latch onto? And that's why millennials don't go to churches today. Mm-hmm. Many of them say, well, you can't give me any answers. You don't give me anything. I may come there and feel good. I can feel good doing anything I want. That's not much incentive to stick to a worldview.
Right.
And it's really easy to have your worldview shifted over to something that tells you, look, you can be inherently good. You can have everything you want. You can be happy. You can have everything at your fingertips. So it really was a crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, we're told not to build our house on shifting sands. And I think that's what was meant by that. You need a strong foundation. And it has to be taught. Our children can't just learn it. So it is a responsibility of our churches to do a good job in that area. And I get what you're saying. Speaking of churches, what is the role of the church body as it pertains to the troubles that we're having right now? This whole social justice and the Marxist usurpation of our system, and they're basically dismantling our way of life and turning it on its head. I mean, the pyramid is upside down, literally, and it's not going to be good. We will end up serving a state, a world state. So, what is the church's responsibility in this? If you read Romans 13, that's the one that keeps coming up, and it's taken out of context and I believe misunderstood. I do believe in righteous resistance to ungodly laws, and I believe in obeying a godly government. In other words, a just government. We're told to obey the authorities. Well, what if that authority is not following God's commands, is not obeying natural laws created by God? What is the role of the church? What does the church need to do? Because I know if the church ever united on this principle of righteous resistance, this would all be over yesterday.
The huge thing that underlies so much of the church today is this huge question, what does the church even exist to do? Because in popular culture today, and in modern culture, what we're being told is that church exists to give basically social welfare, happiness, peace, justice. In a biblical framework, those things do mean good things. We want people happy. We want people healthy. I don't want poor people. I don't want people suffering. Of course not. But the problem is what we have switched over to is redefining the church's goal and all these things too. Ephesians 4 talks about that we're a unity growing up toward Christ, growing up in Him. And it says speaking the truth in love, that we grow that way. Mm-hmm. Well, the church has really quit speaking the truth in love when we're running around saying, the Bible's just one of these books. There are tons of other sacred books out there. Just believe one, make yourself feel good. Mm-hmm. The church, too, has bought into that lie that human nature is inherently good. And if you want proof that that doesn't work, then, see what happens if you put people in any situation that relies on them being inherently good. It's going to fall apart really quickly. Right. That's why we have laws in the first place. But a lot of the problem is the church, back in the 1800s especially, we started having things like social Darwinism, where Charles Darwin writes his book, The Origin of the Species. And that book, by the way, talks about favored races and hierarchies of the people. and how African Americans are lower than whites. Horrible things like that.
Oh my gosh, that's...
And the church, the problem is, he's teaching a framework which says, people develop up towards something higher.
Yeah.
And with social Darwinism, this idea of survival of the fittest, in a way, the church has bought into that too, because it's bought into this thing of, we can all be good. We're all evolving towards something better. It's kind of bought the narrative. Yeah. This goes back to the thing about talking about ideology and inherent human nature. Because, the truth is some of my most wonderful friends are people who are atheists or people who are avowed agnostics. Mm-hmm. And, they'll speak openly with you and they'll talk with you about the mindset of, say, conservatives versus progressives. And they'll say, well, conservatives just aren't emotionally developed. They aren't mentally developed. And they say that to you knowing that you're one of them. Mm-hmm. Those are the ones who are really honest, and they'll have a conversation with you. And they can be really, really friendly, wonderful people. But we're talking about the heart of human nature and the ideology and what underlies all of it.
Yeah, exactly. All right. What's the answer? What's the remedy?
I'm going to go straight to Paul for this.
Okay.
Because this is a question. So when we talk about justice and when we talk about what do we do with the situation we find ourselves in, the truth is we know from the outset, whether you believe in Christianity or not, that we're in a desperate situation when you have a society where people believe truth is so changing that someone up top should decide it for you. Because it means you can't have any framework that's going to be steady at all. You can't have a constitution that functions under that, which brings us to the crisis where we are today. Mm-hmm. But this is where, if we are not believers, then we again need to be looking at what we really believe and saying, well, what is wrong with what I see the self-proclaimed progressive movement doing? Why does that not work? Well, one of those things, go read Bellamy, and I'll tell you, it looks pretty absurd when he's saying the nation pays for it. No, your credit card pays for it because you pay for it, but you don't pay for it. That's a lot of two-stepping going on there.
Right.
So when Paul actually is discussing what Timothy can expect to have happen in the churches, one of the things that he specifically says is that you're going to have to be careful, because there will be people coming in with bad doctrine. There will be people who want to deceive you. There will be people who are confused. And one of the ways to keep a constant spirit of revival, which is really what we need, we need revival in the churches because we need the moral framework back. Mm-hmm. That's not something that's going to come back magically on its own by snapping our fingers. And it will affect everything if it happens. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that he tells Timothy comes in 2 Timothy 4. And he's been talking to Timothy about being careful, being strong, standing strong. And he says, I charge you therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at his appearance in his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. And one of the things that he also says in 1 Timothy 4, this really sums up what he just said because he's summarizing again. 1 Timothy 4, he says in verse 13, till I come, give attention to reading, to exhortation, and doctrine. Well, personally, I think that sums up a really good admonition for us wherever we are today in our position towards the things that we've been talking about. One is reading. Mm-hmm. If you disagree with the Founding Fathers, go back and read what they said. Don't listen to what someone's telling you about what they said. Mm-hmm. If you're open-minded or you're reading the Bible, which I will say if you're not open-minded about it, then look at the evidence for it. Look at the reasonable cause for believing in it. Look at Josh McDowell. He's a great starting point. Look into some reasons for why it's believable. But as Christians, we should be reading the Word and saying, this is what it says. This is what it says justice looks like. You look at the book of Romans, it's all over there. 1 and 2 Timothy talk all about justice. In Romans 1, where it speaks about, in the very, very end of the chapter, Paul talks about how people suppress the truth in unrighteousness because they consent to unrighteous works. He has a long list of what they look like. That same word root can be translated as justice. D-I-K is that word root. So he's basically saying, you know what the works of injustice look like, and here they are. But they'll put up a pretense of something they aren't, which takes us to relative truth.
Wow.
The second component was exhortation. We need to be exhorting people to be reading, to be studying, to be doing their best to understand what's happening. and not just accepting everything as a narrative. Look at what the person is saying to you and why they're saying it. And if you're not sure about that, then look at the perspective from which it is being told to you. For instance, pro-life, pro-choice. That's a perspective right there, even when you hear those terms. Mm-hmm. That's someone's perspective of what life and choice mean. So that's just an example. We need to be building each other up. And then the third component is doctrine. You know, we need solid teaching, whether that's, if you want to say on a secular level, we need to be looking at what our Constitution says. We need to be looking at what the Founding Fathers said. On a biblical level, we need to be looking at saying, what does God say justice, purity, goodness look like? What is God's aim for the church? And his aim for the church is to be preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's not a material gospel. That's a spiritual gospel that affects everything in your life. That's the gospel of salvation. Mm-hmm. So I think those three components, reading, exhortation, doctrine, have a lot of words for us today.
Yeah, I agree with that. And when people ask the question, what are we going to do? What's the remedy? Well, I think you summed it up. I mean, you have to know the truth, for one thing. The sword of truth cuts through everything. It will prevail. And but if you don't read that book, and if you don't understand it, you don't have the armor. You don't have the word. You won't be able to defend yourself, or you won't be able to defend the remedy. I agree. People need to, like you mentioned, both things. People need to understand their form of government and how it is actually supposed to operate, not the way it is operating right now, but without a moral compass. Now, I prefer Christianity, and I think that's the way, the truth. That's the only way. But you've got to have both. And I think that's where the church fits in. And as far as public school education, I don't know if it's even necessary to allow Bibles to be put back into the libraries or in the classroom or not. I don't know if that's necessary. But I do know that we need to be teaching it, and the children need to be understanding it at a very early age, so they've got a good foundation so they can get through this and serve with morality and consistency, because that is natural law, in my opinion. I don't know about how you feel about it, but in the Old Testament, it's basically a textbook on what to do and what not to do. And it also, of course, has prophecy. But
when William Blackstone talks about it, he says, well, this is the revealed law. This is the law of revelation. That is something that people can't reach by their own reason. But he and all the founding fathers who were Christians, all those who don't believe, I would challenge them, with prophecy, with archaeology, with biology, all those things, there is reasonable cause for believing in the Bible. So, I don't take it as a blind faith at all. I take it as something that everything I look at with those, if it points away from the Bible, then honestly, I'll leave it. Mm-hmm. But I always see them pointing to the truth of the Bible. Yeah. And that's something that I think has been forgotten. There is one last note, mm-hmm. which I will read from a little bit of an unusual source. So this is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, talking about, so this is my really old copy here.
Yeah, it's been used.
It's been used. Huxley is showing what a world looks like when God has been completely removed. And there's this really interesting conversation that the main character has. You're smiling. You probably remember this.
Yeah. This book's used a lot.
And this comes up, this is taught in Western civilization. This is taught in a lot of places about what a world can look like without God. And they teach it negatively, they teach it positively, so I'm not saying they even teach it with a certain framework in mind. But the conversation that Huxley puts in here is really interesting, because it's this fellow who's in charge, or one of them in the society, who's known as the controller. And he's having a conversation with a man who has not grown up in this society and saying God is necessary for all good civilization. And this man explains that the people in this society live on something called soma, which is this mind-altering, satisfying drug. And he's basically telling John, the main character, that you don't need to have bad ideas about human nature. You don't need to have bad things. You don't need to have suffering. And he says, Christianity without tears, that's what soma is. And he's really summing it up. He's putting this conversation saying, we don't need to have God. We can have material. We can survive on personal satisfaction. So as much as we've talked about this point between material gospel and social gospel and caring for people spiritually or socially or what the role of government is, this really is a good summation of that. He's saying that if you can meet that with drugs or anything that satisfies you, you don't need God.
Yeah.
So we can tie all that with what we've been looking at and say, well, that's one of the big incentives they have to be removing God. Something that we should all be aware of and wary of as we move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, it's too bad. It really is. We think we can live without that, but I don't think so. To me, that's hell. It's the absence of God.
And very literally, that is how it will be. It does come back to the gospel. And, we should say that's what speaking the truth in love really means, too. If you care about a family very, very much and you see a tornado coming in the way and they're having a picnic, do you love them if you're letting a tornado hit them? Or do you love them if you're letting them keep on having their picnic?
Right. And they come back with, oh, you're being judgmental. I don't want to hear it, But anyway.
Well, if there's reasonable cause for it, then I'm not judging anything. I'm reading what this says and saying, well, that's what it says. And there's evidence that supports what it says. Show me where that is not reliable.
Yeah, that's true. Now, what I hear often is, well, that was written by a bunch of men back in the old days. Okay, that wasn't written by God. Come on.
Then you explain prophecy about how you have things like in Daniel, where it's talking about what's going to happen hundreds of years later and still unfolding now. You explain things like you have the prophecies that are written in 3rd century manuscripts about things that will not happen for 300 more years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is amazing.
Revelation says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. If men are coming up with that, they've got a really good communication system. They must be in my Escape series.
Yeah, exactly.
Time must not exist at all.
Yeah, that's right.
But only a God who's outside of time can see things that way.
Yeah. Well, we always, come to think of it, we do always try to put God in a box of some sort. That way we can control it. But it's impossible. You can't do it. So, yeah. No, I agree with you. I was just playing devil's advocate, and you came back with the right answer again. So that's great. Anything else you want to mention?
Just, I encourage everyone to look into these things and be careful on their own and always look at perspective frameworks in anything, perspectival frameworks. You're looking at who's saying it and why and what the reason is, and is it something you can trust?
Okay.
And thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah. I'm glad you came in to do it. We kind of hit all 3 episodes of this podcast at the same time. You might as well just get it all taken care of. And I'm glad you were able to come in and block off that much time. I have one last question I do want to ask you to conclude everything that we've talked about in this episode. Do the mask mandates need to go, and are the vaccines healthy?
Huge question. And I know they will raise controversy, whatever I say on them.
Oh, we need some controversy right now.
Because we don't have it enough talking about justice. So the thing about the mandates and the vaccines and all that, I would say that, first of all, we see tons of challenges coming to these as unconstitutional because people are looking at, say, due process and Amendment 14, right to assemble peaceably in one, religion in one. John MacArthur has just won a major battle in Los Angeles County because he wouldn't close his church. Mm-hmm. And a huge issue we have with all of this is mainly, does the government have the authority to do all of this without overstepping? And they can say they're doing it for public health and safety, and they can run those things around. But one of the big issues that keeps coming up is, even if it were constitutional, and I'm saying even if it were, I'm not a constitutional scholar, even if it was, let's put it that way, then you have to have a really sound, reasonable argument for closing everything and saying the science is solid.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's a problem to say that science is solid if, as recently as March and April, the government stepped back and said, well, children's desks can be 3 feet apart instead of 6. And they didn't give any good reason for it. And then suddenly it snapped back to 6. Or you have the thing about vaccine mandates, where you say, well, 100 people or more, you can mandate. Well, what's the difference between that and 99? What science says that extra one person? So in all of that stuff, you've got to have a lot of really, really good science going on behind the background, and you need to have a lot more testing on experimental things before you go and say, let's give it to all the 12-year-olds in the country. This is serious business.
Yes.
This is something, there was a case recently someone sent me where a woman has contracted and she died from it, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's the human form of mad cow disease.
Oh, my. Okay.
I know of this because my grandmother had it, and it is very fast. It's very bad. It's locked-in syndrome. You lose the ability to move, speak, and it's very, very quick. And when you look at things that are experimental or things that have just been approved, and you see side effects like that happening, we need to be stepping back and saying, in the first place, is the science even good enough to support that these are safe? Now, I realize that's all very, very controversial, and I'll just go back. People can read it on its own and see.
Yeah, no, I actually, it's not that it shouldn't be that controversial, because what you just stated was fact. By the way, I'm going to tell the viewer that it is unconstitutional. I know that for a fact because I think you were implying that it is unconstitutional what they're doing, and the injections. My understanding with VAERS is there's up over 14,000 deaths post-vaccination. We have stopped injection or vaccinations after 50? I can't remember what the number was, but we've stopped some very so-called important vaccinations very early on.
It's much fewer than that.
Yeah, but nowadays, the government does things that is entirely unconstitutional, and it ends up costing people their lives. We've made it so they're not accountable. These manufacturers of these drugs and these injections that they're posing on people, and really for money, maybe power, I don't know, or eugenics, I don't know. But if you're killing that many people, it kind of makes you wonder, and the reason why they're not stopping it.
Well, and the other thing is, in the past, when we've had the word vaccine, it's supposed to imply that the thing stops. You don't hear about breakthrough cases all over the place. Yeah. That's not something that used to exist. For that matter, now you see billboards and they say, get the flu vaccine. And that used to be a flu shot. But it's a way of normalizing this idea that what you get is a shot that will protect you against, say, one strain, but not all the others.
Right.
So it's problematic stuff. And it's something where, again, we aren't looking at it and saying we're bringing our opinions on this because we feel this way. We're looking at it and saying, at least I know I am, looking at it and saying, I want to know what the truth is out there. So if I look at the numbers and that's what they say, if you look at the science and that's what it says, if you look at the things that are federal statutes about it that are not, if it doesn't go the way that the ideological framework they want is going, then we have a problem.
Yeah. And there's people out there that say, oh, you're a non-vaxxer. No. I'll take a vaccination, but I need to know what it's about. I need to know what it's going to do. And I want to see the ingredients. And,
a coronavirus does, I believe there has been a coronavirus that people have died from. I do believe that. But it is the same family of things as cold and flu. And that's something never before people never used to say you can get a vaccine that will cure the common cold. That's a change too.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's probably the extent of our input on that. We'll just end right there. Thank you so very much, Dr. Polsley, Cara. Thank you very much. And I hope to have you on again sometime, maybe in the future.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Maybe a different topic. I'm sure I can think of something. Okay. Well, this is Verity Seeker signing off. Thank you very much.